Hi everyone, my name is Danielle Fopp and I will be taking today's lecture on environmental impact assessments. So as we know, if we don't complete an environmental appraisal, there are several risks to the project, and in this lecture we are going to continue with the legal demands on environmental standards, specifically looking at the environmental impact assessments and statements. So what is an EIA? Well, it's a formal report that addresses the project's environmental impact from a comprehensive perspective. So they are comprehensive documents. It also needs to address the issues identified in any environmental logs. The EIA may also cover some of the key questions which have been raised during the public inquiries. So they often also touch on the social opposition to the environmental impact of the project and public inquiries. Environmental Impact Assessment, or EIA, refers to any process that seeks to assess the likely or possible impacts of a development or project before a decision is made as to whether or not the development or project should proceed, and if so, under what conditions. These days, it is hoped that almost every decision made by governments, companies, and individuals will include some component of an environmental impact assessment, but the degree of this will vary per project. Now, some forms of environmental impact assessments are required by law, as we saw under the Planning, Development and Infrastructure Act, or under the Mining Act, under the Petroleum and Geothermal Energy Act. However, there are also other provisions in these acts that are important in relation to environmental protection. And for example, we can see that in the Mining Act, there is a referral process for some applications in specially protected areas to other ministers, including, for example, projects in the Adelaide Dolphin Sanctuary area or the River Murray. In other cases, the requirement of a government department to take the environment into consideration when making decisions is purely a matter of policy, and it's not actually set out in any Act of Parliament. So when do we complete an EIA? Well, it needs to be in the early stages to be effective in order to provide trade-offs to design selection, site selection, or other alternative selection. Now, it also needs to be completed in parallel with the technical side, because we know that if it's phased with the project development, then the conclusions that are reached at one stage can be taken into account to define the next set of work. So let's have a look at screening. So the EIA process begins from the very start of a project. Once a developer has identified a need and assessed all the possible alternatives of project design and sites to select a preferred alternative, which we saw happened in the feasibility stage, two important questions must be asked. What will be the effects of this development on the environment, and are those effects significant? And if the answer to this second question is yes, an EIA may be required. And answering this question is a process known as screening, and it can be an essential first step into a formal EIA. And the screening process is done for the proposed development project, and it may have several outcomes. So no further EIA is required, a comprehensive EIA is necessary, a more limited EIA is required for the project, or a further and detailed study is necessary to decide the level of the EIA needed of the proposed project. And it must be stressed that this EIA process, it is iterative, so we can see on the screen there, it's actually a part of all of these stages. And it's demonstrated at this early stage of screening where the requirement for a formal EIA and its associated cost implications can lead the developer to reassess the project, and it works its way all the way through to the impact assessment, through the scoping, through the baseline study, and also in impact prediction. And it's very important in impact prediction because obviously once the baseline study information is available, the important task of impact prediction can begin, and this involves forecasting the likely changes in the environment that will occur as a result of the development. And this directly links into the impact assessment because this phase involves the assessment of the identified impacts, which is why it's called an impact assessment. This requires interpretation of the importance or significance of the impacts to provide a conclusion which can ultimately be used by decision makers in determining the fate of the project. So who completes an environmental impact assessment? Well, usually it's an environmental officer who's appointed at the early stages, and they will coordinate all aspects, both internal and external. It's also advised that the use of local skills is employed, for example, experts, local universities, for better knowledge of specific problems in the area. And you also may need to lean on the use of external experts, both local and international, which can provide independent judgment on the assessment, which may be needed to satisfy all parties. Obviously, this all depends on the size of the project and on the perceived impact to the environment. So let's take a look at a hypothetical EIA and work through it together. So potential areas of impact to include are on the screen. So this is not an exhaustive list, this is just a snapshot of some of the things that you may need to look into if you are working through an EIA. And these will also lead into and inform any potential mitigation measures. Now, some of these impacts on screen will occur during construction. For example, traffic and transportation will be impacted during a construction project, and some will occur during the operational phase of the project. And that might be utilities and infrastructure, it might be health and safety, it might be changes to the local noise levels or lighting conditions. And the various impacts of the project predicted during the construction phase could be impacts on the use of land, it could be impact to the geology or topography, including natural resources, air quality, impact on water due to construction or pollution runoff from the site, increase in the noise level due to the construction activities and the types of equipment used, and any green initiatives to mitigate the impact. The various impacts during the operational phase could also be further commercialisation of the area, traffic congestion issues, the look and feel of the area may change, and employment opportunities due to the project may change. So these are just some of the things that need to be considered when looking at an impact assessment. So frequently, the assessment of impacts will reveal damaging effects upon the environment, and these may be alleviated by mitigation measures, and we've seen mitigation measures throughout this appraisal process. Mitigation involves taking measures to reduce or remove environmental impacts, and it can be seen that the iterative nature of the EIA process is well demonstrated here. For example, successful design of mitigation measures could possibly result in the removal of all significant impacts. Hence, a new screening exercise would reveal that there might have been no need to carry out a formal EIA had the mitigation measures been included from the start. So we've got taking measures to reduce or remove environmental impacts, and we've also got to focus on the most significant environmental effects. Now, the third step is the definition of a strategy to mitigate these significant environmental effects, which couldn't be reduced or removed initially. And mechanisms should be identified to minimise these significant effects as far as possible. Now, this could include feedback of the technical requirements to alter aspects of the design of the infrastructure or output specification when such changes can significantly reduce the environmental costs. For example, small changes in road design can be enough to avoid a valuable heritage region or a valuable area of rainforest, dramatically reducing the corresponding environmental impacts. The mitigation strategy should also focus on measures to compensate for any inevitable environmental consequences, and a lot of the time this includes things such as tree planting if there was deforestation in the construction project. The aim here is not to neutralise environmental impacts, but specifically to mitigate unintended consequences given the regulatory requirements that will need to be considered for the final environmental approvals. So we're going to look at the EIS again in terms of the environmental impact statement. Now, an environmental impact statement details the anticipated environmental impacts of a development on the environment, as well as proposing avoidance, mitigation, and offset measures. An EIS is prepared by a proponent to enable decision makers to understand the environmental consequences of a proposed development. The EIS must include sufficient information to ensure that all environmental, social, and economic impacts associated with the proposal have been identified and assessed, and any adverse impacts are avoided, minimised, mitigated, or as a last resort, offset. But like I said, we're not trying to offset. Significance of the impacts includes performance against thresholds, standards, or comparative projects in the area. And we are also going to be looking at inputs from community and stakeholders, which is part of the consultation phase. And often the Environmental Impact Statement or EIA report is made available to authorities with environmental responsibilities, local and regional authorities, and to other interested organisations and the public for review. They are given the opportunity to comment on the project and its environmental effects. As part of all environmental assessments, the consultation stage seeks input from the public to inform the work of assessing proposed major projects for potentially significant adverse environmental, social, economic, health, and heritage effects, to name a few. The purpose of public involvement is to inform the stakeholders about the proposal and its likely effects, canvass their inputs, views, and concerns, and take account of the information and views of the public in the EIA and decision making. This is fed into the environmental impact statement. So we've seen throughout this appraisal process that regularly this concept of consultation and the stakeholders comes up, and we will be looking at this in further detail in a few topics' time. So we're now at a point where we can go, okay, upon completion of the environmental appraisal, there are no specific aspects of the project that make environmental approvals impossible. That's a tick. Upon completion of the environmental appraisal, there are no known specific aspects of the project that makes the cost to obtain approvals prohibitive. Well, that's a tick. Community consultation has been conducted and all outstanding issues have been resolved. That's a big tick. We now know that large variations to the project are not required to obtain approvals, so we are now in a better position to make our recommendation to the client on the project.